Hello, it is working. Good afternoon. Different setting, different room. Title of presentation, Development of the Profession, a Personal View. And that really is a personal view. So am I right, am I wrong? I don't know, it's for you to decide. Development of the profession. I'm not an academic, so my knowledge comes from observation. And again, do I observe correctly? It's for you to decide whether you agree, disagree. I don't mind. In that, it is basically a personal view. I also, if you want to respond, if you want to start a discussion, I don't mind. It's more an interaction, an interchange, as far as I'm concerned, than me trying to tell you what I think is right. Because who am I? Who am I? Well, I'm Robert de Vries. I'm chairman of DAYS. I think that was obvious from this morning. I'm a civil engineer, and I have a degree in quantity surveying. Now, I'm part of ISAC, or have attended ISAC meetings. And ISAC meetings, they have interesting subjects sometimes, like what's the difference between a cost engineer and a quantity surveyor? Now, I've some ideas about that. Are they relevant? I don't know, because that's the other problem with personal views. I'm living in my world. My world at the moment is ISAC, is DAYS, is this Congress. Am I a little bit narrow-minded? Possibly. So, please feel free to interfere. Please feel free to have a different opinion. I've been accused of complicating things, and I hope I can prove that here. What have I looked at here? It is, first of all, I did quantity surveying. What is quantity surveying? As far as I'm concerned, it is law, it is technique, it's economics, and actually the interface between those is what we call quantity surveying. That's how I have been trained. I've been trained at the Polytechnic. It's currently a university. I don't know if that's a devaluation of educational systems or, I don't know. But that's my degree. What is the law element? Contract law. Basically very simple. If you look at the law and lawyers, it is such a wide field. If you look at what we need, it is very small. It is some contract law, it is some general understanding, a little bit of public law, but our law that we need for our profession is relatively limited. Economics, well, you can see the list. That's a long list. That is from estimating, cost management, cost control, etc. Technique, that's interesting. Because what is for me the big difference between a cost engineer and what the cost engineering profession is trying to do and a quantity surveyor. As a quantity surveyor, I was taught a little bit of technique. I was taught building regulations. I was taught civil engineering. We did that, I think, in 2 lessons. Petrochem, also 2 lessons. That doesn't match. The technical knowledge of the quantity surveyor, in my experience, was far less than of the cost engineers as we are. And you see that, I think, in the UK, for instance, where in order, and also in DAYS, by the way, in order to become a cost engineer, you have to have an engineering background. So there is a difference, there is a discrepancy. What you also see, or what I think I see, is that the cost engineers lack legal knowledge. That is considered to be for somebody else. I don't see, and even in our education of certified cost engineers, we do touch on legal, but not to the same extent as that you were trained, I was trained as a quantity surveyor. Where do we find each other? In the money. Yeah, that's our subject. What we do is quantify everything and put it in dollars, euros, pound sterling. That's one side of the profession as I see it. Then yesterday we had a council meeting. And again, the subject of are we quantity surveying, are we project controllers, are we cost engineers, are we building economists, are we whatever, what are we? And what we in the end concluded is that we should look at the skills. We should granulate it down and actually look at the skills required in the professions. And that is what we see within a days. Yeah, we have a special interest group on scheduling, on planning. We have a special interest group on value engineering. We have a special interest group in contract management. You're actually a number of specializations that are required for the cost engineering profession, or as Isaac calls it, the cost management profession. And one of the things we see is that they're even more and more specialized. Yeah, in the old days, can I say that? I don't know. But you knew all, or at least you thought you did. Nowadays, you have the specialized, you have the risk manager, special department very often in companies. You have value management, a different set of skills that is used in some companies. We have specialized to such an extent that it is difficult to know what the cost engineer, if you want to call him quantity surveyor, project controller, what he is. I think what you will find, or what I think I see, is that when you are a true cost engineer, you're effectively a manager. And being a cost engineer and management, I sometimes have issues. But yeah, it's a different skill. And especially when we start making management a profession, it is different skills, it's different people. So when we talk about the cost engineering profession, we need to think, are we talking about educating estimators? Are we talking about educating value managers? What are we talking about? Or are we talking about generalists who know something about these areas? Another discussion that we often have is how does especially project controls differentiate from project management? And that's a very difficult question actually, because I believe that the project manager should be able to do project controls. If he wants to be in charge of his project, he needs to understand the schedule, he needs to understand his budget, he needs to understand the cost control, he needs to understand the risks. So where is the difference? What I tell internally is a project manager, what he does more than the project controller, he actually builds. And I'm very happy I'm not a project manager. I only have to control. What does the project controller do that the project manager doesn't do? The more complicated dossiers. If you have insurance issues, if you have warranty issues, that type of thing, that is involvement of legal, that is typically the role of the project controller. We have very often a discussion, at least in my company, about knowledge and know-how. Now in Dutch, there's some Dutch here, it is kennis en kunde. You can have theoretical knowledge, but if you don't know how to apply it, you don't have know-how. And we are always asking for people with a lot of experience. We don't trust anybody anymore unless he has a lot of experience. But when I ask some of my colleagues, and I said, how old were you when you were the first time doing a project by yourself? And then they say 30. So how does that match with our current need that everybody should have 10 to 20 years experience? It doesn't match. We are either overreacting or we are failing to allow people to make their mistakes. And of course, the mistakes shouldn't be so big that you have a problem. But let people make their mistakes. That's the best way for them to learn. Applied experience or applied knowledge is, in my eyes, know-how. Then I once went to a course or a lecture, I can't remember what it was exactly, and he got into a discussion, what is knowledge? Does knowledge come from books? He said, oh, okay, knowledge comes from books. And the poor farmer then, who hasn't gone to school, doesn't he have any knowledge? And of course he has knowledge. Yeah, he has knowledge through observation. There are several ways to gain knowledge. It doesn't have to be books. But in our minds, and yeah, we are all educated in this profession, yeah, we think of knowledge as being from books. It doesn't have to be. It's also observation. And is observation automatically experience? I can assure you it is not. Yeah, if I'm a funny guy, curious, if I see a waiter or a waitress in a restaurant take away the plates, you see them pile them up, you see how they put the fork and the knife so that they don't fall off. I've seen it, never done it. So yeah, there is definitely a difference between knowledge and know-how and experience. In this train of thought, and realizing that experience is perceived as being very, very important, you see that in the old days, yeah, we had project managers who started as a fitter, who became chief office, who became a project manager of a smaller project, who grew. They grew through experience. But then we found out education, and we discovered that we wanted our children to be best positioned to have the best careers possible. So we tried to push their education levels as high as possible. And immediately we also said, well, if you are a bachelor, you should be working as a chief office engineer. You shouldn't be doing welding or work preparation, perhaps. You are expecting your own perception that you stream in at a higher level. And that is where the discrepancy emerges, yeah, where we say we need experience, but you also need the knowledge. And what we have tried within my company is we have tried to make communities. We have tried to get the experienced and the young educated together and exchange information. This is an example from my company. I by the way, work for Stork, which is a contractor in the mechanical and E&I world. So sometimes I will definitely have an aberration and an opinion based on being a contractor rather than an owner. They appear to be different worlds. If you look at how that translates to cost engineering, you see that different levels. At the top, you have a typical career of a quantity surveyor, as I was, as explained to me. What you also see is here, that is from a presentation in Milan, where they actually talk about experience. Yeah, because if you have 20 years experience, have you got 1 year experience 20 times? Or have you 20 years experience? And this is sort of the repeat that you are looking for at certain levels. A welder does his weld. He may, or better, a conveyor belt worker. I don't know if you've seen Modern Times from Charlie Chaplin. No? Too old? I know. That is Charlie Chaplin, you know, he's old. But he is then working in a factory, a production factory, and he has to do 2 bolts. And if you do that 20 years, you have 20 years experience fixing 2 bolts. But I think we all know that's not the sort of experience you are wanting, which you want to grow up with. As a profession, we have a lot of knowledge. Yeah, but what you see here is 3 publications produced by ISAC members. The first one is Total Cost Management from ACE International, the American association. Then a price booklet that we produce as DACE, and the ICMS. There is an awful lot of knowledge in our industry, but it is all hidden in organizations. It is not necessarily available to everybody. And that makes it more difficult to access. As I said, I like to complicate things. What I looked at some stage is how do we save knowledge? How do we capture knowledge? And I got very tired of lessons learned where there was being said the quality of the personnel wasn't sufficient or wasn't as expected. And then we all agreed, and that was the lesson learned. The quality of the personnel was not sufficient. And I thought to myself, what good is that? Yeah, you need to, if this is a problem in your industry, which it could be, then what are the measures you as an organization create in order to avoid the quality of the personnel not being sufficient? Logic itself, I would have thought. But that means that you have to write down how you're going to do that. That means you have a manual or a process or something, but you have written down what you plan to do. If then your conclusion is the personnel isn't up to it, then the next question is, did you follow your own procedure manual? And if so, what is wrong? And if you have that, if you can find the delta between what you planned to do, what actually happened, you can actually look at the delta. You can make an action plan for the delta. You can make it actionable, and you can put it in your manuals, and then you have it captured. I don't know if any of you have lessons learned sessions. Yeah, at some stage we put together the lessons learned of 5 or 6 projects. We had a list of 200 points. And how many people did look at it? You don't. So for me, the lessons learned and the learning, which becomes far more important in our daily life as we are, is something we need to think about. How are we going to do this? And if as associations we have such a big body of knowledge, how can we improve that body of knowledge for the greater good for everybody? What we also saw, and this is from my business, is that we built power plants or refineries or what have you. And customers tend to all have their own ideas and own limitations and own considerations to be aware of. So for us it is very important as a company to understand what our way of working is, what the demands of the customer are, and how you bring them together. In other words, you make an execution plan. And there you can say, I'm now working for a customer, this is my scope, this skill that is required for this customer in these circumstances are very difficult to obtain. I am going to do sourcing in Timbuktu, and then you can check afterwards if that plan, if that worked, and if you got something from it. And another thing about the lessons learned that intrigued me is we do it with a lot of people. We make those lists and we put them in a database somewhere or not. But effectively, it's the people who have experienced it that are consolidating their experience. They don't need to know. They've experienced it. So at best, it is a reminder for them. You could argue that it is a consolidation. So together, you think about what has happened and therefore you have a little bit more deep learning. But the rest of the organization has no benefit from it whatsoever. It is with those people who have learned, who have the experience. And that, again, is why I strongly believe in trying to upgrade the manuals that we have as a profession or that you have as a company. I put in culture. That is because when I did this, I was thinking of my own company, and there are, of course, many competitors, and yet we are not all the same. So what makes it different? It's the culture within a company, and each company has a culture. So that's why the culture is in there as well. And all the other ones we have touched. What you, I think what I see in our industry at the moment is an enormous interest and risk, and an enormous interest in shifting the risk to the other party. And in order to do that, we have lawyers. And the lawyers are becoming more and more active in our industry. If you think of the first three circles, they are somewhere in isolation. They very seldom know a lot about our techniques. They are not particularly or not always familiar with our commercial systems. So they produce documents shifting liabilities, because that's their hobby, without necessarily knowing what it means for a project. We are, in Dutch, juridiseren. I haven't found an English translation for it, but it is, we're making everything more legal. And I don't think that's beneficial to us. Tomorrow, Hans Bakker is talking about people and how he believes that working together, working with a common goal, working in the interest of the project is everything. And this is one of the biggest issues that prevents that happening. It is making the suboptimalization that we create by creating all these parties, having lawyers try to shift the risk to the party who is less capable of carrying it. Because I don't know if you realize, but if you have an oil company with some assets in the world, they have quite some flexibility. If you then have a contractor and you shift all the risk to the contractor, he has a lot less assets and security. Contractors are, of course, very honorable. That is why we subcontract to subcontractors and try to shift all the liabilities to them. They have even less meat on the bones to carry the risks. So there is a few things wrong, and as far as I'm concerned, in how we treat risks, liabilities, how we treat risks, and the liabilities. What you also sometimes see, and that is this one here, the nice, I don't know what it is. It also started in 1998 as the Inner Circle, and it was an attempt to identify what type of contract would be best suited for what type of work. Now, I'm not going to go through it because it's a hobby and I have 10 minutes, that would take a bit longer. But the thinking of what type of contract you actually should use and what commercial model you should use, depending on what you are trying to achieve, is very important. Yeah, I've worked with an alliance. And what is an alliance? That's also one of those terms that everybody has its own interpretation of. But my interpretation is it is including the customer. And why did the customer choose to create an alliance? He was making a product, a fiber for bulletproof vests, and his capacity was insufficient. He needed more capacity. And he was afraid of replacement products. So time was everything for him. Now, if time is everything for you, then money can't be, because they are contradictory. Of course, it isn't fully true. I agree. But it can't be. You need perhaps the controls over it, but if you choose for time, then you choose for overtime, you choose for inefficiency, you choose for parallel working with all the irritations from that. But if that is what you want, then don't make it a lump sum. Because if you try to make that a lump sum, you know one thing for certain, you have one huge contractual conflict. A lump sum, if we did relocations. That meant we actually took down a full plant and moved it from, for instance, Moerdijk, here in Rotterdam, to Argentine. Or from Norway to Antwerp, a whole factory. Now, the taking down of such a plant is perfect for a lump sum, because it is there. You can exactly see what it is. And that type of thinking, in order to choose what you want, I think is very important. Sometimes customers actually look for the conflict. Yeah, if you have a customer who has very poor control over his operators, and at the end the operators come through and say, "Ooh, I don't like where this valve is. I want it a centimeter higher because I'm slightly taller than the average." And they get away with it. Yeah, there are customers who say, "I don't want that." This, of course, is quite a ridiculous example, I know. But if you then make that a lump sum, you can be sure of one thing. The contractor will come to you and say, "Centimeter higher, sir?" "Certainly, sir." "So many euros, sir." "Oh, and by the way, an extension of time." You can create a conflict if it is in your interest. Most contracts, I don't think it is in the interest to create the conflict. But you can. It's a choice. I have a few more loose comments. What I see, 5 minutes, it's good. You won't have time to ask questions. That's good as well. We have the saying, trust is fine, but control is better. And we see that the financial people, the accountants, have taken over a lot of the settings where we are working. And the question is more control necessarily better? What I'm seeing is what we can do nowadays is go into huge detail, create a lot of data try to find the cost of the last bolt, screw, nut, and then we think we are in control. I would like to suggest we aren't. I think by going into the detail, discovering that the administration of it is normally not as consistent as we would like, creates a phony assurance of the accuracies that we have. And I would very much like to think or promote thinking about what level of detail do we really need, and what does the people we report to actually do with that knowledge. Because, yeah, I don't know, in your company, and of course our company doesn't do that, but sometimes you're asked questions about details that even if you tell them, what can they do with that information? Absolutely nothing. But it costs you a lot of time to produce it. Probably somewhere there is somebody who has to consolidate all this information. To me, it sounds like a waste of time. I think I have to say, I love to discuss this with you. So if you have any questions or want to approach me afterwards, I'm very interested to discover if my view looks a bit like your experience. I think, unless there are questions, or no, let's open the floor to questions, because I haven't got the message yet that I'm finished. Are there any questions? Any first reactions? Roger. Just shout, I'll repeat it, or go to a microphone. Go to a microphone, because the online people won't be able to hear you.
Turn it around, do I? Oh, well. Excuse me. Excuse my back. I can go that way. Interesting what you're saying, Robert. And interesting to hear that you are one of the real engineers as a civil engineer. My own experience, I trained as a civil engineer. I started work in civil engineering. I then moved into what was then sort of project management as a site agent and project managing a series of projects. And many, many years ago, I was acquired, I think is probably the expression, by BP, British Petroleum, into what they called their estimating department within the finance division as a cost engineer. And since then I spent something like 40 years in cost engineering. And my interpretation of what a cost engineer is, as opposed to a quantity surveyor, an accountant or what have you, is the chap who is in the front of the boat when everybody is going down the river and the finance man at the back says, oh, we've just passed this tree and that tree and all the rest of it. And the cost engineer is the man in the front and says, hang on, chaps, sort of 200 yards ahead is a rapid. No, we should watch out for that, whereas the others are all looking behind and the cost engineer is the man who should be looking forward.
I agree 100%, Roger. It is, especially administration and accountants, is trying to predict the future from the past without seeing the rapids coming, because there weren't rapids before. It is, our profession is predicting the future. That's why I think we need technical knowledge.
But bearing in mind that we know what the river looks like behind, still looks like behind.
Yes, there's knowledge in there.
Okay, thank you.
Is it time? I'll come to you separately, because I've been told off. Thank you for your interest. You have been stunned into silence. I hope that was because it was interesting. And if not, have something to think about. Thank you.